Ethan Cole signed a piece of paper one quiet afternoon. No shouting, no protests, just a clean signature at the bottom of the page. They called it a safety measure, and by every rule on the books, it was the right call. What no one wrote down was what came after. A rail town emptied out, a community scattered, and one woman pushed out of the only life she had left. So here's the question that won't sit still. When you do the right thing, who pays for it in the end? If this kind of story speaks to you, hit like, share it with someone who gets it, and subscribe to the channel. Ethan Cole lived where the rails gave up, just past the last signal, just far enough that the town forgot his name. He'd spent most of his life keeping trains from colliding, listening to metal before it screamed, watching clocks instead of people. When the line shut down, he didn't argue. He packed his tools, kept the pocket watch, stayed. The house sat beside the old tracks, quiet except for wind and rust. Some mornings, he still walked the line, checked bolts that didn't matter anymore. Habits are hard to retire. Mara Wells arrived without ceremony. No suitcase worth mentioning, just a thin jacket and papers folded too many times. They said her housing had been dissolved, reassigned, transferred, like a crate with the wrong label. She didn't ask why she was there, didn't ask how long she'd stay. She took the room near the storage shed and closed the door softly. Days passed without names being spoken. Ethan fixed what broke. Mara cleaned what didn't belong to her. She learned the creak of the floorboards. He learned the sound of her footsteps. That was enough. Sometimes she stood by the fence, watching the empty rails. Sometimes he watched the clock, stopping it before it chimed. If she had spoken more, the story might have gone faster. If she had told him where she'd come from, or what had been taken, maybe something would have broken open. But she didn't. Not because there was nothing to say, because some pain, once spoken, gets owned by whoever hears it. So she let her hands do the talking, straightening bent shelves, sweeping dust no one noticed anymore. Each small act said the same thing. I'm still here, on my own terms. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. He noticed how she left space between words she never said, how she never touched what wasn't offered, how she stood like someone who had learned not to lean. He told himself he'd done the right thing. He'd signed off to keep people safe, to stop a disaster before it happened. The paperwork said so. The law agreed. But right and finished are not the same thing, because doing the right thing doesn't mean you arrive on time. Sometimes it just means you show up after the damage is done. Holding a clean conscience and nothing else, Ethan carried that weight quietly, like he carried everything. He didn't explain himself, didn't look for absolution. Some debts don't ask to be forgiven. They ask to be lived with. Evenings came slow out there. The lights stretched, the rails cooled. They ate in the same room without speaking. 2 chairs, plenty of space between them. It wasn't peace, not yet. It was a pause, a fragile one. And if you're listening closely, you can hear it. That tension, that unasked question hanging in the air. Because when 2 people share silence like that, it's never empty. What do you think they were both waiting for? Mara started with the storage shed, the kind of place people stop seeing after a while. Bent shelves, broken crates, dust thick enough to write names in. She didn't rush it. 1 box at a time, keeping what could still be used, letting the rest go. Ethan noticed the sound first. Wood shifting, metal tapping back into place. He didn't ask what she was fixing, just handed her a screwdriver when she needed one. Out by the tracks, he worked on the signal. The red light hadn't turned on in years. Most folks said it didn't matter anymore. But he climbed the ladder anyway, replaced the wiring, cleaned the glass. Every click of the switch was familiar, comforting, like counting breaths. They didn't call it rebuilding. They didn't call it staying. They just kept showing up. Mara lined up the tools before sundown. Ethan wound his pocket watch at the same hour every night. Small things, ordinary things. But in a town like that, ordinary doesn't go unnoticed for long. Someone saw Mara at the market and whispered, said she wasn't from around here. Someone else noticed the signal light glowing red again, asked why an old man would bother fixing what was already shut down. By the end of the week, the stories had found each other. She doesn't belong. He's hiding something. The words moved faster than truth ever does. Through coffee cups, across counters, out in the open, but never to their faces. Mara heard it in the pauses, in the way conversation stopped when she walked by. She kept her head down, kept her hands busy. Ethan heard it in the looks, the long ones, the measuring kind. He didn't correct anyone, didn't defend himself. He'd learned a long time ago that explaining feels too much like asking permission. Still, the weight crept in. At night, he sat by the window and watched the signal light blink red against the dark. Working, waiting. He told himself it was enough to do things right. That if you followed the rules, the rest would settle. But rules don't rebuild homes. They don't give people back what they lost. Out back, Mara fixed a broken gate no one remembered breaking. She tied the wire tight, tested it twice. Ethan saw it from the porch, the way she checked her work, like she expected someone to come undo it. Nothing stayed hidden anymore. Not the repairs, not the distance, not the quiet agreement that neither of them was leaving. And that's when the stairs turned heavier. Healing, when it happens out in the open, makes people uncomfortable. It asks questions no one wants to answer. Why her? Why here? Why now? Mara felt it in her chest when footsteps slowed behind her. Ethan felt it in his hands when he reached for his tools. Some things can be fixed with patience. A shelf, a wire, a door that won't close right. Other things don't bend back so easily. Reputations, history, the stories people tell when they need someone to blame. Still, they kept working, because every nail driven in was a choice. Every light turned back on said the same thing. Not everything broken deserves to stay that way. And as the rumors grew louder, the silence between them grew steadier. Tell me this, when the world starts watching your every move, do you keep repairing what you can? Or do you step back and let it all fall apart? Mara found the folder late in the afternoon, when the light had already started to thin. It was wedged behind a stack of maintenance manuals, the kind no one opened anymore. Paper swollen from damp air, corners bent from being moved but never thrown away. She hadn't been searching for anything specific, just clearing space, trying to make the room breathe. The title caught her eye before the words did. Rail Line Decommission Report. She stood there longer than she meant to. The shed was quiet except for the wind slipping through the gaps in the boards. She opened it. Dates, measurements, risk assessments written in clean, confident language. This section is unsafe. That section no longer viable. Operations suspended to prevent loss of life. All reasonable. All careful. She turned the page. Names followed, one after another. People who had signed, approved, and disappeared back into their own lives. Then she saw it. Ethan Cole. His signature sat near the bottom, firm and familiar. The same handwriting she saw on notes taped to the wall, On labels he'd written for tools that no one else used. Her fingers tightened around the paper. So this was it. Not a rumor. Not a guess. Not something passed along through half-finished sentences at the market. It was right there. Quiet. Permanent. She closed the folder slowly and slid it back into her arms. Outside, Ethan was working near the signal post, wiping grease from his hands with a rag already stained beyond saving. The red light blinked on. Off. On again. She walked toward him without calling his name. He noticed her footsteps and turned. She held out the folder. For a moment, he didn't take it, just looked at it like he recognized the weight before touching it. Then he nodded and accepted it with both hands. They stood there in the open, the track stretching out behind them like a line that never quite ended. He didn't open the folder. Didn't need to. "I thought I was stopping an accident," he said. The words came out even. Not rushed. Not softened. That was all he offered. No apology. No explanation wrapped in better language. Just the truth as he'd carried it. Mara waited. She didn't interrupt the silence. Didn't fill it with questions. Some truths don't need follow-up. They land. And that's enough. Ethan leaned against the post and stared down the rails. He remembered the meeting, the charts, the warnings no one wanted to read twice. He remembered how easy it had felt to sign, how right. The law had been clear, the risk undeniable. No one talked about where people would go afterward. They never do. Doing the right thing, as defined on paper, rarely includes instructions for what comes next. He hadn't thought of faces, or kitchens, or rooms left half-packed. He'd thought of collisions, of metal folding in on itself, of bodies not making it home. He'd done his job. And still, some consequences don't show up until much later, when the paperwork is finished and the damage has learned how to walk. Mara didn't accuse him, didn't raise her voice. She turned and walked back toward the house, the folder tucked under her arm. Inside, she placed it on the table between them. Not hidden, not destroyed. Just there. That night, they moved around each other carefully, like the space itself had shifted. Ethan wound his pocket watch once, then again. The ticking felt louder than before. They ate in separate rooms, not out of anger, out of adjustment. Outside, the signal light kept blinking red against the dark. Didn't know anything about intent, only function. Truth works the same way. It doesn't arrive to fix things. It arrives to change them. The real work comes afterward, in the days that follow, in the choice to stay when leaving would be easier, in the decision to keep repairing things that no longer promise forgiveness. Ethan didn't turn the light off. Mara didn't pack her bag. They passed each other in the narrow hall without speaking, both aware that something fundamental had shifted. Not broken, shifted. The rails outside waited, unchanged by confession or silence, and the question settled in, heavier now that it had a shape. When the truth costs you the comfort of not knowing, what are you willing to live with after that? Luke Harlan arrived just after noon. No sirens, no shouting. 2 trucks rolled in slow, tires crunching gravel like they belonged there. Men stepped out with clean boots and clipped folders. Not muscle. Paper. Luke walked ahead of them, coat neat, smile practiced. The kind of man who never raises his voice because he doesn't need to. He nodded at Ethan like they were old friends, like this was a courtesy call. "We're just here to straighten a few things out," he said. No threat in the words. Just wait. He opened a folder and held it loose in one hand. Residency status, employment records, transfer orders with stamps still fresh. Everything legal, everything final. Mara stood a few steps back, hands at her sides, eyes forward. Luke didn't look at her at first. "She doesn't meet the requirements to remain here," he said, almost apologetic. "Nothing personal." One of the men behind him shifted his weight. Chains clinked lightly against a truck bed. Not for show, for work. Ethan listened without interrupting. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the watch, checked the time, snapped it shut. Luke followed the motion. Curious. "You can sign here," Luke said, tapping the page. "We'll take her where she's assigned. No trouble." The wind picked up along the tracks. A low hum traveled through the steel. Ethan turned away from the men and walked toward the signal post. Luke frowned. Sir Ethan didn't answer. He climbed the ladder slow, deliberate, every rung familiar, every movement earned. At the top, he brushed dust from the lens, set his hand on the switch. Luke's smile thinned. "You don't want to do this," he called out, still calm, still polite. Ethan flipped the switch. The red light snapped on, bright, unmistakable. Down the line, a horn sounded, a long one. Operations halted, schedules broken. Luke's jaw tightened. "That light's not authorized," he said. Ethan climbed down and faced him. "It works," he said. That was it. No speech, no explanation. Mara stepped forward then. She didn't touch Ethan, didn't say a word. She just stood beside him, close enough to matter. Luke looked at her now. Really looked. There was nothing in her face to negotiate with. Behind Luke, one of the men checked his phone, shook his head once. Delays cost money. Paper only works when the machines keep moving. Luke exhaled slowly. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. Ethan didn't move. Neither did Mara. Some lines aren't drawn with ink. Some boundaries don't announce themselves. They just hold. The red light blinked again. On. Off. On. Luke closed the folder. Not slammed, just closed. He nodded once, sharp. "This isn't over," he said. Ethan met his eyes. Didn't say it was. The trucks pulled away the same way they came in. Slow, controlled. Dust settled back onto the gravel. The tracks hummed again. Waiting. Mara stayed where she was. Ethan reached for his watch, then stopped himself. They stood there in the open, the red light burning behind them. No victory, no relief, just a line held. And sometimes, that's the loudest thing a person can do. If it were you standing there, would you have stepped back or flipped the switch anyway? The trucks were gone by dusk. No cuffs, no arrests, no one cheering. The gravel settled like nothing had happened. Luke Harlan drove away with his paperwork clean and his hands empty. He didn't lose, but he didn't win either. That's how it usually goes. People expect justice to be loud. They expect someone to pay right away. But the worst prices are never collected on the spot. They're collected later. Ethan stood by the tracks long after the dust cleared, the red light still blinking behind him. On. Off. On. Mara watched the road until it disappeared into the heat. Neither of them spoke, because there are moments when words would cheapen what just happened. The truth is, men like Luke don't see people. They see units, documents, assets that can be moved when the numbers say so. It's clean that way, efficient. You don't have to know a name. You don't have to remember a face. And for a while, it works. Until one day, you look around and realize no one is standing next to you. That's the cost. Not prison, not failure. Isolation. Luke had authority, connections. The law folded neatly into his pocket, but when the line was drawn, he stood alone. No one followed him back to the truck. No one put a hand on his shoulder. Power doesn't feel heavy until you're the only one carrying it. Ethan felt the weight, too. His hands shook when he finally reached for the switch again. Not from fear. From knowing what he'd chosen, he could turn the light off, let the schedules recover, let the machine keep moving. That would have been easier. Mara waited. She didn't ask him to be brave, didn't thank him. She just stayed. And that was the difference. When you treat people like property, you train yourself to believe you don't need anyone's consent. You forget how much strength it takes for someone to choose you freely. Luke never learned that lesson. He walked away intact, but unchanged. Ethan learned it late. He learned it standing beside someone who didn't owe him loyalty, forgiveness, or gratitude. Someone who stayed anyway. That night, the town stayed quiet. No one came to check the signal. No one knocked on the door. Just the steady ticking of the pocket watch on the table. Time passing. Unimpressed. Mara sat across from Ethan, the space between them smaller now. Though nothing had been resolved. They hadn't fixed the past. They hadn't won anything. But they had refused to turn away. And sometimes, that's the only victory people like them ever get. Out on the tracks, the red light kept blinking. A warning. A boundary. A reminder that some lines exist for a reason. And when you cross them enough times, you don't get punished. You get left alone on the other side. Tell me this. If doing the right thing meant standing there with no one behind you, would you still hold the line? Life didn't change all at once after that. It rarely does. Morning still came early. The kettle still whistled. The rails still cooled under the sun. Ethan woke up, wound his pocket watch, and stepped outside like he always had. Same boots, same slow breath before the day began. Mara kept the shed in order, swept the floor, stacked what could still be used. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been forgiven. But things kept moving. They passed each other in the narrow hallway with a nod. Not friendly, not distant either. Just present. Some days they worked side by side without speaking. Some days they stayed in separate corners of the same house, listening to the same wind. There was no promise made between them, no name put on what they were doing. And maybe that was the point. Not every story ends with people choosing each other out loud. Some end with people choosing not to abandon themselves. There are men who go their whole lives without anyone stepping forward for them. They work. They endure. They keep their heads down and learn not to expect much. There are women who learn early how to stand alone, how to leave space around their hurt so no one can touch it without permission. If that's you, this story isn't here to tell you that everything turns out fine. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you do everything right and still eat alone. Sometimes you hold the line and no one thanks you for it. But there's a quiet kind of dignity in that. A kind that doesn't ask to be seen. Mara never asked Ethan to stay. Never asked him to make things right. She stayed because she chose to. And that choice mattered more than any promise could have. Ethan never asked for redemption. Never asked to be understood. He kept fixing what was in front of him because it was there. Because leaving would have been easier. That's what people miss. Strength isn't always loud. It isn't always shared. Sometimes it's just the refusal to turn away, even when no one would blame you if you did. The town didn't soften overnight. Some doors stayed closed. Some looks stayed sharp. But the signal light kept blinking red when it needed to. A boundary held. Time passed. Not the kind that heals everything. Just the kind that proves what lasts. Ethan and Mara never became a neat ending. They became a rhythm. Work. Rest. Silence. Enough. And for those watching from the outside, wondering what this story was supposed to say, maybe it's this. If you go through life without anyone stepping out beside you, it doesn't mean you failed. It means you learned how to stand. And sometimes, standing is the bravest thing a person ever does. So I'll leave you with one question. Not as a lesson, not as a challenge. Just something to sit with. What are you carrying right now that no one else can see?